So let me talk a little bit about why this matters to us
Yes,
historically.
I was just going to say, put this in context for us.
You know, for the kids, you know, when the president goes out, he's always surrounded by lots of people who do a lot of work for him. There's aides and assistants and all of that. And so this man, Richard Halstead, who wore this jacket and this kepi, was an aide to the highest ranking Union general to die in the American Civil War, a man named John Sedgwick, who was from Connecticut. Halstead probably had no contact or no knowledge of Sedgwick before the war, but became known to him during the war. You know how? Actually, he got in trouble. Halstead got in trouble. He was court-martialed and became somewhat of a public figure by virtue of his court-martial. He kind of told his boss, no, he's not going to do that. So he ended up discharged from one unit, went into another, and somehow Sedgwick, we don't know how, learned of him, knew of him, and became great friends. And not only that, but he became friends with Sedgwick's sister. And so Richard Halstead came onto the staff and became one of a group of about 10 or 12 men who traveled with Sedgwick everywhere. You know, whenever Sedgwick went, he was followed by an entourage, just like the president is today, just like Kirsten is today. I followed her in the building today. She's the big boss. And they became, actually, Sedgwick and Halstead became very close friends, to the point where if Sedgwick didn't have time to write a letter home to his sister, Richard Halstead often did it for him. So, and there are several letters like that have been published. John Sedgwick, who was an older man, was much beloved. In fact, I know the Army of the Potomac as well as anybody, the Union Army that was out here. And there's no officer in the Army that had more affection directed toward him, even before he died, than did John Sedgwick. And his staff was almost familial to him. They were very closely bonded. They were all together on the morning of May 9th, 1864, and if you want, I'll take you down there later to the place if you have time. Sedgwick was doing what generals do, just kind of making sure everything was okay. He was out of the line of fire for the most part, but then he saw something up front that he didn't like that his soldiers were doing, and he went up to correct it, and rode into an area that had been the subject of attention from Confederate sharpshooters, literally sharpshooters. 2 Union officers had been seriously wounded in that area that morning. Sedgwick went in and was kind of fixing the line, and he had a couple of conversations with soldiers who had, you know, because you could hear the bullets when they went by, and the bullets were coming from about 500 yards away, about a quarter of a mile away. And you could hear the bullets, and a couple of men dodged and ducked, and General Sedgwick told them not to do that. And, you know, there was no use in doing that. By the time you heard a bullet, it was already by you anyway. There was no value in that. And he got into a little conversation with the soldier who said, well, I always dodge, and I think it does me good. And Sedgwick kind of laughed at him. And then at another time, he said the very famous, almost unfortunate quote, because it marks Sedgwick as something of a historical curiosity, that he told his men not to dodge because they couldn't hit an elephant at that distance. And within a matter of minutes, he was struck right below the left eye by a sharpshooter's bullet and died instantly. Halstead wasn't right next to him when it happened, but he was nearby, as was the rest of the staff, and rushed to him, but it was instantly clear that Sedgwick had been killed. Some of the items that Louisa brought here, these small items, were reputedly on Sedgwick's body, on his being when he was killed. And the staff was crushed by the loss of this man they loved so much. The nation took notice. There was a tremendous outpouring. As I said, he was the highest ranking Union general killed during the American Civil War. And then the Army made the unusual gesture of designating 3 men to escort his body home to Cornwall, Connecticut. and Halstead was one of those men. And it was probably during that escort process that he wore this jacket. We're not sure he wore it on the day that Sedgwick was killed. He almost certainly wore the kepi the day that Sedgwick was killed. And then traveled through by wagon through Fredericksburg to Belle Plaine, and then eventually by boat up to Washington, D.C. There his body was embalmed and then sent home to Cornwall, Connecticut, where a massive public funeral was held. And then Halstead returned to the Army and would continue in service for really until the end of the war. So Halstead's an interesting man. He was not a particularly robust man. He died in 1881 as a relatively young man. Never wrote anything that we've ever seen about his experiences that day. We wish he had. There's the great painting of Sedgwick after his death. We don't know that Halstead is you've seen this, surely.
Yes,
I'll have a few copies for you. This great image. Halstead is not probably shown in that image, but was certainly in
Can
the
you bring that
neighborhood
she's
for
trying to
sure.
take a picture on?
And
Can you see it?
but one of the most vivid images we have it on this, a copy of this on display in our exhibit as well. So for us, people come here to touch history or get as close to it as they possibly can. And so knowing that hat, the man who wore that jacket, and maybe the jacket itself, were at this scene at that moment, that mattered so much to the nation is a tremendous thing for us. And so we're very grateful to get these items.
Well, and I was thinking maybe, Louisa, you could talk a little bit about the other things that you brought out, and then talk about the conservation of the jacket and the kepi and what will happen with it.
Sure. So as John sort of mentioned, we brought out the contents of
I
Sedgwick's
haven't
pockets.
seen those at all.
We purchased these a couple of years ago from an art dealer, and so the coin was actually in Sedgwick's pocket the day he died. Then this letter here was written to authenticate it, and this woman Emily added I believe it's either a pocket
like
knife
a
or a
little-
really tiny letter opener. And then this is the 6th Corps, which General Sedgwick was in charge of, and his hair is actually braided or intertwined within
you're
that.
kidding.
And so then this woman Emily put them all together on a key ring, like a normal key ring that you have today. We purchased both of these a couple of years ago. That's why I wanted to bring them out for you today, so you can see some stuff that we have related to Sedgwick. And so the frock coat is actually in very good condition.
Isn't it?
It is.
Yes.
It's impressive, really. And the initials that are in his left shoulder is still very, very legible. I imagine that, I'll take this back to storage and I'll probably just give it a good vacuum. We have a special vacuum called a HEPA vacuum, which stands for high efficiency particulate air. And it's just, has a variable speed control so that I can control how much speed suction is going to happen on the jacket itself. And when we do eventually one day probably put this up on display, we'll send it up to a conservator to mount it for us on a mannequin. The kepi, on the other hand, needs a little more conservation, but that's okay. We've done it before. In fact, the one kepi that's here on display, before we put these exhibits up a couple of years ago, we sent out for conservation. Had some sort of similar issues. The brim wasn't attached anymore, and then the band as well. So we'll send those up to a conservator. They'll make a mount for it, and then they'll reattach everything, and then they'll clean it as well. So not a big problem at all.
This is such an important piece. I don't know if you've gone through the exhibit, but we have a space back here where there are 2 uniforms on display, one Union, one Confederate. And we can't keep those on display perpetually because they'll get destroyed by light. So our plan is to use this to rotate one of those off.